Our next presenter is RLB's own Dana Gidge. So Dana shows a dedication and care in everything she does. She's been an HR professional for most of her career, and her passion started early as she realized the best part of HR was relationship building. She enjoys creating an environment where employees can think big, have fun, and do good work. She understands that people are a business's best asset, and working on engaging employees is rewarding for all involved. She's definitely well suited to our firm. Our slogan as a firm is people count, and Dana certainly exemplifies this in her personality and the way she presents herself. Certainly a fun-loving, caring individual, so she's kind of perfect for the role. Her ability to make relationships makes her a valued member of the RLB HR consulting team. Her unrelenting passion outside of HR is her family. She married her university sweetheart and moved to Ontario from Newfoundland 15 years ago. She's the mother of 2 active boys who keep her on her toes. She knows what hard work is and prides herself on passion for her job, her family, and her friends. As I mentioned, I did scope everybody out on Twitter. Dana is getting a little nervous right now. I will mention that she's had almost a 3-year hiatus from Twitter, but that's not what I'm going to comment on. I did scroll back from December 2017 all the way back to 2015. It kind of exemplifies exactly what she's saying in terms of her passions being HR, her family, and our firm. I couldn't find a single tweet except for one that related to Disney that didn't have something to do with all 3 of those. So, with that, I'll leave it to Dana to take us onto a journey on HR at a glance.
Thank you, Murray. I was rather scared because I thought you were going to creep my Facebook account, and Lord knows there's lots to be said there, but certainly true. I've been with RLB for well 7 years now in December, which is definitely great for me. Prior to my work experience with RLB, I did take 5 years off and spend at home with my kids, and something that I really true value, that time with my kids. And prior to that, I had a 10-year career with a division of Magna, so in manufacturing for 10 years, where I like to say I was baptized in fire pretty much every day of that job. I have a few comments first. Certainly, Julia, I love that storytelling. I'm from Newfoundland, so storytelling is a big part of my culture, and I absolutely love that story. And anytime you can put food into it, I think you gain everyone's attention. So I totally love that. Karina, future of work, absolutely love the Gen Z, the millennials as well is something that certainly I'm passionate about when it comes to recruiting. But I kind of want to pick up on 2 things there. One is my son's actually in grade 8 right now, so they're just starting the year. They're actually in school, and he came home one day last week and he said to me, "Mom," he said, they're starting to talk about career because next year they'll be in high school in grade 9, and he said, you know, my teacher told me that my career is not even existing yet, so I don't need to worry about all this, Mom. So I think you're right there. The second part of that is I think maybe we're doing our parenting a little bit wrong because we're trying to encourage our kids to go in careers with pensions. So maybe I need to talk to you after that, and we'll sort all this parenting stuff out. But certainly your presentation was amazing. So what I want to do is I want to take the future of work. I absolutely love looking at the future of work, but I kind of want to bring it back down into the trenches in HR every day. And I know that in some of the not-for-profits groups, you're not really big enough to have your own HR department, which is really great because RLB does have the HR consulting side of the business. My job is about 95% of my work is done with our clients or clients outside of the firm. And what I do is I'm kind of on-call HR for when you need someone to talk to and you get that gut feeling and you're like, oh, something's not right, I need to call someone. So I'm kind of that gut check, I kind of sometimes say. So I kind of want to bring it down to a little bit more of a in the trenches everyday level. So I'm just going to see, Mary, do I have access to move my slides?
Yes, you should. Go ahead.
Okay, we'll just see if it. Oh, so first, I thought we'd kind of dig into the trenches a little bit with regards to HR. We always talk about compliance, legislation, regulations that are out, and certainly I want to talk a little bit first about pre-COVID. So when we went before March of this year, actually before May of this year, when pre-COVID days, and I want to talk about the contract of employment. So every employee should have an employment contract in place. If you don't have one, I think what we've learned over the last 6 months is you really do need one, certainly when it comes to terminations, change of employment status, and other things along those lines. So one of the things that's been a big popular thing right now, especially in early spring when we did some layoffs, is this notion of the 13 weeks of temporary layoff. And what it said is that actually if they didn't have a clause in their employment agreement for layoff, then we technically couldn't lay off an employee. We would risk constructive dismissal. So one thing, if I can encourage you going forward on any employment agreements, is to make sure that you do have a temporary layoff clause in your agreement. That's really important. If you're in a unionized environment, not so important, because usually there's a temporary layoff clause in the collective agreement. But certainly during that time, it was you kind of had to talk to your employees. You had to let them know that, hey, due to COVID or whatever business constraints, you were going to lay off. So what that meant prior to COVID was 13 weeks of temporary layoff. What that really meant is after 13 weeks on layoff, you now had to terminate that employee. And that meant everything that comes with termination, including termination pay, severance pay, and if there was no employment agreement in place limiting termination to these things, then it was open to a common law entitlement, which, as we all know, that can certainly open up a risk to an employer with a much, much larger payout. If we did have an employee on temporary layoff, we do have to continue benefits. If we do continue benefits, that can actually stretch that 13 weeks of temporary layoff to about 35 weeks. So it gave us as employers a little bit more time to figure out what was going on. But then we talk about the notion of constructive dismissal. And this is any time that we look at an employment agreement between an employer and employee, and we change some of the major terms of their employment agreement. So if you think about that, some of the major terms that we look at is hours. Wage is certainly a big one. And that's probably two of the most common things that an employer has had to change in the last 6 months. So prior to May, all these things were some really big considerations that employers had to consider when they're looking at layoffs during the first round of COVID. So what happened? So in May, we had some changes because all of a sudden the government realized those 13 weeks are coming to the point where employers had to make a decision to terminate the employee or bring them back to work. And sometimes they were not able to bring them back to work because either they were still closed, they were not deemed an essential service, or a number of different issues. So what they did is they looked at this ADEL, or infectious disease emergency leave. So that was actually the first phase of this was put into effect in May. And what it done, it was a temporary amendment to the Employment Standards Act. And then it was again renewed in September 4th of this year, bringing the infectious emergency disease leave still to be in effect until January 2nd of 2021. So yes, we've got a few more months where we have what we call this ADEL. So I want to kind of explain it to you. And first of all, I want to say that I'm not a lawyer, and nor do I intend to represent myself as one. And the information I'm giving you is more informational to let you know what's going on in the area of HR right now. And where sometimes, that gut check says, oh, well, maybe I need to look at this before I terminate an employee or put an employee on layoff and those other things. So it is a job protected leave for people on layoff or people who have had their hours reduced due to COVID. So other job protected leaves, when I say that, it should ring in your ears. Some other job protected leaves would be family responsibility leave, maternity leave, certainly one parental leave that often comes to mind. And with job protected leaves, of course, there becomes a greater responsibility on the employer. So before this time, if anybody, if the employer actually changed the employee's hours or reduced their pay, the employee could claim what we call constructive dismissal, saying that you changed a major term of the agreement, so now I'm going to add no other choice, only resign and find other work. So it would be deemed as a constructive dismissal, and they could actually sue the company for that. However, under this new protection, what it did for the employer side is now all of a sudden anybody who is off during a layoff or a leave or a reduction in hours, so maybe they're doing 20 hours instead of 40 hours a week, or they're doing 30 or whatever, or even a decrease in pay during this period, it would not be considered a layoff, but they would be on leave, and then the employee could not come back and say this was a constructive dismissal. So it was a big protection for the employer side of things. So it's not considered to be constructively dismissed if during this period, from now until January 2nd, you temporarily change the hours or the wages of an employee. However, what I want to give you some caution about is after January 2nd of 2020, this is no longer a protection. And if you do change employees' hours from their original employment agreement or their wage, then that could again trigger constructive dismissal. Or all of a sudden, if they're still laid off in January 2nd, it now puts a reset to that 13-week termination. So you want to really consider that when January comes. So if you're going to make some decisions on employees that are off, I think you should look really hard and strong about it prior to that January date. Again, we don't know if that will be extended and what that will look like, but certainly we want to keep that in the back of our minds. And of course, if they have no employment agreement in place limiting them to employment standards payouts for termination, then you also want to look at those considered common law impacts of termination. So one of the questions that I often get is under this protection, oftentimes when someone's on a maternity leave, you would not ever want to terminate an employee on maternity leave because of course you're violating some human rights, and there's going to be a bigger payout if you're going to actually terminate this employee because it's really against legal requirements. So of course, if you're going to terminate an employee and they're off on a leave or they have reduced hours right now, you're actually terminating them when they're on a job protected leave. So of course, there's going to be more consideration upon a termination when we talk about payout for that individual. So keep that in mind if you are having those decisions during this period. So what does it mean for the employee? So it also protects the employee, much like a maternity leave would protect an employee that's off as well. So anyone that is undergoing a medical investigation, supervision, or treatment for a disease, specifically for COVID, that is in there. We'll talk a little bit later about people can still get sick and people can still have medical concerns and not be related to COVID during this period. And if you want, we can talk about that a little bit later. But of course, anyone that's acting in accordance to a public health guideline, so whether that be they have the symptoms they call public health and they say they need to stay off work, or they are required to quarantine or isolate or control the measure by public health official, a health practitioner, or even a telehealth. So anybody that needs to be off during this period related to COVID, they would be covered under this leave. It's also direction by an employer in response to a concern. So some of you, maybe you've had an employee that's come in recently that said they have sniffles or they have some of the concerns related to COVID, and you said, well, okay, you need to go home, either work from home and wait those 2 weeks and get a test, or sorry, we can't have you in the workplace. You can't work from home, so we need you to be off. We need you to take the test, and once you get the negative test result, you can come back. So that time when they're off would actually be considered an infectious disease emergency leave, and it would be a job protected leave, meaning after that's over, you have to re-employ them. So also person providing the care or support. This has been a big question. So maybe they have ailing parents or they have a child that is immunocompromised. And certainly in the beginning of COVID, we had school and daycare closures. Some of that is opening up. Some of our kids are back to school. But if you're like me, even last week, we had a scare on the bus for my son. And while he wasn't involved in it, another friend's bus, the kid literally has to stay off for 2 weeks because someone on their bus is at symptoms and tested positive. So if you're in a job where you need to stay home and take care of your child for that period, you would actually be under this leave. Also, anyone who is on travel restrictions that may have traveled where there is a quarantine in place, sometimes they can work from home during this quarantine. If not, they would have to take the job protected time off. And also the impact on the notice periods for termination, as I talked about before. We can terminate. It is not just something that would be recommended, but certainly there's a ton more considerations when you talk about notice periods for termination, simply because right now during COVID, there's an increase in, when you look at the common law entitlements, even things like employability right now is really low compared to what it was prior to COVID. So you want to look at a number of multitude of different things to make sure that you've kind of built in some compensation or notice period for that COVID consideration as well. And of course, during an Adele, you would have to totally look at that as well. So it could certainly be a much, much higher payout. So I kind of want to tilt, I guess, if I'm going to use Karina's analogy there a little bit and go to recruitment and some of the market conditions. So I love what Karina talked about recruiting and all those things, because I do believe that we are moving and shifting from a career ladder to a career lattice. So they're really going diagonal. They're going all over the place. I think you're seeing people with multitudes of different careers and changing careers at different points in time. And often during periods of change like COVID, what you're seeing is that kind of like that Hayes survey, where people are getting in their mind that they want to leave the organization. And there could be a number of factors for that. Maybe they've been in there a long time. They feel like they need a rejuvenation and a different change. And maybe their employer is not giving them that. Maybe they just want to see all of a sudden, family's more important. This is more important. I'm looking for something with more remote work, or something gives me more flexibility and creativity. So there's certainly lots of different changes in our market right now. First of all, different labor pool. Again, unemployment is at a really high right now. So certainly our labor market is, candidate-wise, is much, much larger than it was before. If we want to look at supply and demand, we have a good labor candidate pool out there to pick from, which is great. Something that I've noticed in postings, and I'm not sure if the audience can kind of address this or not, but certainly in the beginnings of COVID, we didn't do much recruiting at all. And I didn't see much recruiting for clients either. So, people were kind of waiting to see what was going to happen and go from there. And what I'm seeing now is a little bit of a different shift, is that I'm finding that people are, I don't know if they're getting more positive about the effect of where COVID's going to go, or just feeling a little bit more settled in COVID, and that they are starting to rehire again. So I am seeing a shift in rehiring. What I'm also seeing is some proactive recruiting. So what I mean is they're looking beyond COVID, and they're looking at this high candidate pool, and they're saying, who's out there that we can get, that we can really build for our organization looking forward after COVID. So some really proactive recruiting going on, and I'm excited to see that happening. I know during RLB, we've actually continued to recruit over this period because, again, we want to look at proactive recruiting and some of the candidate pools that are out there. Another thing I think what we'll find is for some jobs, there's actually a faster recruiting time right now. Certainly jobs where there was requirements to do a lot of in-person interviews. In-person interviews takes a bit of time to arrange. I would still consider doing pre-screening with candidates, but certainly now that, especially that first round of interviewing, can certainly be done via Zoom. And for the most part, even your second or third level can also be done by Zoom. What I'm finding is we're calling candidates, and there's no longer, I have to wait and try and find work for my employer to let me take time off work then to drive in to do the interview. That wastes a day. We can kind of actually schedule a lunchtime Zoom where they don't have to miss work, or there's a lot less obligation, and we can literally get an interview the very next day, or sometimes even the same day. So I'm finding that's cutting down on some of that recruitment time as well. So that's exciting in the world of recruiting. Also differing viewpoints. When we looked at resumes even prior to COVID, if someone had a gap and they were laid off, your first question is, well, why were they laid off? Was it a performance concern? Did they decide to leave the company, or did the company let them go? There were all these different viewpoints on why there was a gap in their resumes. And what we're seeing now is anyone who's applying for positions, if we see a gap, March, April, May, anytime during the summer, I think our automatic mind goes to the fact that this person probably was affected by COVID. So certainly our differing viewpoints as to why people were let off, it probably had nothing to do with performance, because we're just in a very difficult time for many businesses right now, and they had to make some really hard decisions. The other thing that we're noticing is certainly work arrangement type. And what we're noticing is candidates are also asking for certain types of work arrangements. So we've all kind of heard about the mass exodus out of Toronto. I don't know if you're looking at the cottage market, but good luck trying to find a cottage in a reasonable rate right now. There's just been some mass exodus where people have realized that they can work remote, and some employers have actually said, hey, we're going to work remote indefinitely. So people are kind of moving outside of that area for a number of reasons related to COVID. So what I'm finding is candidates before never really asked, was it remote work? Now they're certainly asking. And as an employer side, we're also explaining whether or not that work and the intent is to move back to the office if it is a temporary work from home arrangement right now. So you want to make sure that that discussion with candidates and with your new hire that's coming in is certainly discussed in the interview stage, so that the expectations going forward is clear and forthright, so that we make sure that we're actually giving them all the information that they need. So that's kind of a little synopsis on what I'm seeing. We do a lot of recruitment for clients. So we're certainly, I guess, knee deep into the recruitment market right now and some of the things that we are seeing. Recruitment wise, the interview, I think we've certainly moved to a digital recruitment era. COVID's kind of forced us to be into the Zoom marketplace. I actually use Zoom quite frequently prior to COVID, doing a lot of recruitment in different areas and geographical areas. So I was kind of already prepared for Zoom, but nothing to the extent that I am using Zoom now. I think this week alone, I've probably been on Zoom for, well, up until today, pretty much every hour except for maybe an hour to eat each day. So Zoom fatigue certainly is something that you talk about, but digital recruitment is certainly being done that way. At least what I'm seeing the first couple interviews is doing that way. So digital recruitment meaning interviews, but digital recruitment also meaning where we're posting jobs. And I think prior to this, we also posted a lot online, but certainly digital recruitment has come to the forefront now. The also thing I want to talk about in the interview is culture. Just because you're doing a Zoom interview or you're doing it digital doesn't mean you need to ignore culture. Culture is forefront to any interview, to talk about what the company's culture is, what that looks like, and really you want to look at not only the skills and abilities of that person, but do they fit within your culture profile. And I love taking Karina's words is, where's your culture going to go in the next little while? You know, will COVID have an effect on your culture, and will you be making changes to your culture based on where COVID or where the new next era, the new era is going to bring you in culture. So as an organization, when you're looking at strategy and culture and vision and all those things, keep that in mind for sure. Of course, as always in an interview process, you want to look at consistency of questions and be fair to all candidates as well. If they're all done via Zoom, you keep them all via Zoom, and you make sure that if there's any testing done, that they also all receive the same lot of testing. And also consistency in who interviews, right? You want to make sure that if there's an interview panel, that they're all the same for all the candidates. And what this does is it helps avoid different intricacies with regards to some protected grounds. So when I know it's really hard sometimes, you want to chit chat with candidates and learn a little bit more about them, but you really shouldn't go around any questions that would be related to ethnicity, to race, to family, any of those things. And sometimes it's really hard, you know. So the weather is always a great thing to talk about, but you would never ask anything related to, especially now with COVID. A lot of women are off because of responsibilities with children, and they could see that as a bias if if you talk about family, that I'm not hired because I have children in COVID right now. It's really hard. So kind of avoid those conversations and questions around, always avoid them around protected grounds, but certainly now more than ever. Virtual interviews, again, Zoom, Teams, any of those, they're always great and they're always time effective. What I have been noticing still is there's a wide variety of my clients where there's a partial reintegration back into the workforce. So maybe they've gone totally remote at the beginning or partially remote. And now, so for example, I was a client yesterday, we were doing some recruiting. There's literally 27 people in the organization, but only 8 people were back into the office. So the third interview with them will be in the office with protocol in place, but they really feel it's important to look at having that kind of seeing the person, seeing what their gestures are like, what their body language are like, all those different things that can kind of tell you a lot about a candidate. And I say that I kind of have a funny story. I was interviewing for a controller position, and I had this lady, and she was, she was polished, she was in a great suit. And I remember we came into the interview room, and she sat down, and halfway through the interview, she kind of like started slouching and doing this and putting her leg up, and as she got more comfortable, her body language just totally changed. And all I could think of is, I can't put you in front of a client, like if you're going to be like this. So it was totally different. So it is something to be said for an in-person final interview. So we're going to go on, and we're going to talk about orientation, because a lot of you have gone to remote work, and you're talking about how do we manage orientation during remote work. First of all, you have to decide where is orientation taking place. Is it going to be in the office? Is it going to be remote? And you also have to look at, if they are coming into the office, that they need to pass these COVID screening questions. So as we all know, as of September 25th, every employer is mandated to make sure that employees do a pre-screening prior to coming into the workplace, not if they're remote work, but certainly if they're coming into the workplace. And that is essential even for new people, whether they're coming in for orientation, all those other things. And talk about the expectations. If you're a new candidate and you're starting and there's that 3-month probation, most candidates will pretty much do everything they can to make sure they're there every single day for those 3 months, because it's their probationary period. And likewise, an employer's expectation is that they're still on probation, they're still going to come to work. So you have to have that conversation about, what if that employee, that new employee, is feeling unwell? Do you want them to still come into the office? Is there an option to work remotely? And what are those ramifications for that employee if they're not feeling well? Because again, we're dealing in the world of COVID, and we have to really follow the parameters put in place for that. Other things to talk about during orientation is, how is this new person going to create team development with one another? Some of the things that we talk about is, we always used to do, HR would do the orientation in the morning, and then IT would kind of come in and do a little bit of orientation, and then lunchtime they would all meet with their team members and go out for a lunch, and they would actually get time to socialize and get to know this new individual and their team. So now what we've kind of looked at doing is doing some virtual lunches where we pick maybe their training advisor, their leader or mentor, and they get a chance to, where we actually offer skip the dishes, and everyone can get the skip the dishes delivered to their home, and then they can have their lunch together via Zoom, and get even some of those icebreaker questions where you can kind of, I think, I know one of our offices are really big. They do like 2 truths and a lie, and you have to kind of figure out which one's the lie. And of course, it's the totally new person, so it's kind of difficult sometimes. So team development is still big, it's still expected. And team member expectations are more important now to be spelled out at the beginning in orientation than ever before. Because these expectations, especially if they're working remotely, are going to be some different expectations than in the office, because there's less chance to get to know this person and to communicate sometimes when you're at remote work. So IT considerations as well. We have people starting, and we want to make sure that they have the technology that they need to actually take part in orientation and to start their work effectively. So what we've done is, sometimes if they start on a Monday, we actually Thursday courier out their laptop to them and all the other things that they would need. Other things is office tours. So certainly if you're in the office, do office tour at a socially distanced pace, but also look at if they're remote. It's still important that they get to know your office environment. At RLB, I know our marketing team, I'll kind of give a shout out to Mary and Sarah there, did a really great office tour, and it really took into the changes that COVID had in our workplace. So what that means is that they kind of did like an airline, and they were the stewardesses, and they were literally telling us the pathway to the bathroom, the pathway back from the bathroom, how we use the photocopiers, and all those new things that were kind of put in place as a result of COVID. And now we have that. It's a recording. We can show it at every single new orientation. So it's really, really great, and really great effective way to use that. And it kind of gets creative, right? So it's exciting for our marketing team to be able to do that. And they did a fantastic job. So icebreakers, again, continue to use those. And always lastly is remember your compliance. Just because they're remote workers in their home, there's still compliance concerns. Nothing's changed on that side. They still have to do prevention starts here, HR and AODA in the code. If there's WMIS involved, they still have to do that. All the things that they need to do, you want to make sure you talk about that. Also, maybe even talk about expectations of a home office and what that looks like. So lots of conversations with regards to orientation. So some of the changes in HR, we've seen remote work. Certainly remote work is, some organizations have been kind of forced to go to remote work. But others have kind of chosen to go to remote work, depending on how it's been. Normally, what we would do in a pre-COVID situation is we would have what we would call a formal agreement in place with the employee. So some of you may have that already, where there is like a work from home policy or procedure or an agreement, and that employee there may be some stipulations in normal times when that employee can work from home, depending on the amount of time they've been there, their type of job, things like that. But there might be some type of formal arrangement in there. I kind of want to touch on the fact that as we are reintegrating back into the workforce, so back into the workplace, I should say, from remote. So I'll tell you a little bit about our RLB's story. As we did totally go in March, decided literally in like a matter of 4 days, we were going to go totally remote. And Christo and the senior management team were amazing at getting that in place. And that now we are actually in the stage over the summer getting workplace reintegration back into the organization. So not everyone's back. There are some people that for medical reasons and other reasons, they probably won't be back to the office for a while. But there's other people that actually long to get back to the office because the work at home situation just did not work out well for them. Well, either they had small children or they had other concerns, and they really liked the fact that they could work from home. Work from the office again. So you got to consider the workplace integration. You can decide if you want to make that voluntary or you want to force reintegration. What we're finding is a lot of people, and this is in client work as well, not necessarily even RLB, is I'm getting a lot of clients call me and say, we've been on remote work because of COVID, and now I'm getting employees calling in and saying, can I make this a permanent arrangement? So I want to talk about that for a little bit. Work, the location of work is a part of their original employment agreement. So again, we want to make sure when we're really cautious of changing things is that we don't make this a permanent change, because you don't have to accommodate every single concern that comes in. What you want to do is if you are looking at doing a permanent change to a remote workplace, is that you do put a formal work remote agreement in place. And remember, once they're off and you're changing a major term of their employment agreement, it's hard to get them then back into the workplace without both agreement from both parties. So what we're suggesting is try and keep it temporary in nature, at least until COVID's over. Oftentimes we're getting calls as well as that, there's family accommodation concerns with regards to either my kid's going to do full remote learning, so I need to be there, or the child's doing partial where they're just going to school in the day and they're home for remote learning, or their child is just coming down with other things and they feel that they have a compromised immune system and that they need to be accommodated, or they're taking care of an elderly family member. So that can trigger a temporary change in work location for a remote work, but there's nothing saying you have to make that permanent. So always have the discussion, have the discussion with the employee, and don't always jump to the fact that because they ask that I need to accommodate them permanent work from home. That's not the case, but certainly you want to look at the protected grounds, and those protected grounds may only be in place for temporary. So you want to look at that as well. Certainly some of the changes that we're also seeing in HR is an intentional team support. Again, especially if your workplace has gone remote and you're not seeing the people that you normally see on a regular basis, it's hard to check in. And what we're finding is it's hard to have that social context with the people that you work with anymore. And what we're doing is, especially first when we started, a lot of the people would get together on Friday for Zoom and kind of eat together from their homes and have a chat. So that was kind of their time together. But there's also certainly other intentional team support. In HR, I know we made an Excel spreadsheet and we actually touched base with pretty much everyone in the organization with regards to how are you doing during COVID, how are you doing working from home, and keeping them regular touch-ins, and so that we can see what's going on. We also have some employees that are actually living alone. They could be young and living alone or older, and those have their own unique set of questions that need to be asked and need to be talked about. So we want to make sure some of the things that we did do is we kind of sent a few people living alone a basket saying, hey, we know you're living alone. Here's just a little basket to thinking about you and kind of give you some things to do. And I think we may have sent one of our like promotional little games with it and things like that. So certainly intentional team support is really important, and especially service teams, things like that. Check in with your people. Mental health considerations, I think as Karina kind of touched on that, it is one of the biggest concerns going forward, and COVID certainly exacerbated those. And where we're going to be on the mental health side of things after COVID is over, we don't even know. I mean, there was a study from Sick Kids saying kids should go back to school. I think I'm in support of that, knowing how my kids are feeling now. But not only that, but in the workplace as well. I've personally been working from home since March, and there's days that, you know, I crave to be in the office to see those people, and I do go in certain days a week, and I love those days to go back and just even see people. It's really a great thing. But lots of mental health considerations that I want to go through, and I want to kind of bring it down to a very practical level. Some of the things that we've done and I've seen clients do for mental health considerations. Certainly, first of all, some resources that you can give them. Your employee assistance plan is always great to pull that out, shake the dust off it. Let employees know that you have it, and kind of even make up maybe an email with all the things that the EAP can do for them right now. I know they've got extra webinars, things on there. If you don't have an EAP through your benefits plan, now may be a good time to consider that. The other things is you can look at, like, there's lots of free resources out there. Here 24/7 is a great resource. Homewood here in Guelph is another one. Beacon is a great one. There's also lots of free webinars. If you look at, I know the University of Toronto has one. It's called Managing Mental Health During COVID. These are all free resources that are put out by very reputable institutions on mental health. So certainly get involved in that. One of the unique things that we did with regards to RLB is we actually did coffee chats. So we did a Zoom over lunch where people were just invited to attend. And we had some prompting questions, but people were just trying to socialize with friends, let people know how they were doing mental health wise. And we had phenomenal attendance and some really great discussion in those coffee chats. The other time is certainly if you are HR or you're the HR representative or you're the manager owner and you're kind of taking up that HR umbrella hat or whatever you want to call it, is really make time for your employees to come talk to you if they have concerns. Because even though they may have a job and they may have a paycheck coming in, we don't know what their spouse is going through. We don't know what their kids are going through or their parents are going through. And these are all things, again, that really, really do influence the person as a whole. So the mental health considerations could be maybe they have a job, but maybe their spouse doesn't. So those are really some challenging times to have to go through. And certainly we're not expected as HR professionals or even owner managers to have the answers for everything. I think our biggest job as an organization is to listen. We can give them the resources that are out there, but also to listen. We don't have to solve their problems, but sometimes just listening and understanding and giving them the confirmation that we understand is really, really great. So certainly learning to listen is important, and encouraging time off. Like I know a lot of people haven't wanted to take vacation because they're like, where are we going to go? What are we going to do? So certainly encourage vacation, encourage time off. If you have personal days, encourage those as well. Kind of look at things as well. Like there's lots of different work arrangements that you can do in a temporary nature if the person is having mental health considerations. Look at the possibility of flex work. Flex work doesn't mean that they do any less work than what they did before. It just means that there may be different times that they may do their work. So if they have children at home, maybe they have to do an afternoon and an evening. or maybe sometimes because of mental health concerns and that's going on, that they need to take an afternoon nap to just kind of get themselves through the day. So look at those flexible work arrangements. Again, it doesn't mean any less work, it just means different times of that. And it can be a temporary change and not necessarily a full commitment to flexible work if that's not what your culture is. I think also a big consideration is leading by example. So when you lead from the top, big things happen. And I know our management team's been very important with all the communication that's been happening during COVID. Communication is probably one of the biggest things as well that we've got out of COVID, is to make sure your team and your employees are up to date with what's going on, and that there's some type of transparency, not total transparency, but certainly some level of transparency. And leading by example is really, really important. If you're going into an area that requires a mask and you're a senior management team member or a partner, you want to make sure you have that mask on because you're leading by example. So certainly employees are going to do what you're doing. So lead by that example. One of the last things I want to talk about is performance. So there's been a lot of questions I'm getting from clients as well, is do we do performance reviews this year? You know, Dana, it's been a year that everyone's been kind of forced to do stuff and look at things, and their job has changed just due to COVID, and our concentration is totally different than it was before. So what would you suggest for performance? And I've had some discussion with lots of different partners on this, and different stakeholders in different organizations. And I think the bottom line is I do believe that each generation, no matter where you are, do also want feedback about their performance, whether it's during COVID or whether it's not. We actually did do a survey in our organization and asked them if they wanted a performance review, and overwhelmingly we did have people say that they still want it to be a part of that performance review process. However, there may be some concessions or some considerations that you might want to look at when you're measuring performance in the midst of COVID. Not saying that you have to give them a free hall pass or anything like that because of COVID, because you certainly don't have to, but there may be some considerations around how their work has changed, how well they've adapted to work. Certainly if they were forced to go to remote work, give them some leeway on that. But just opening up that discussion, even if it's not a ranked performance, I do believe the value of the discussion is certainly much, much more valuable than not having that, just because it's a hiccup year through COVID. So I believe that's all for me. Any questions?
Yes, Dana, we do have some questions. We're running a little later than planned. I will just mention to everybody, I did mention to the presenters that we may go a little past the 11:45 end time. If people can stick around till noon, then that's great. But I'll give you a couple of quick questions. I think the responses should be pretty quick, and then we'll see how we do with time for the remainder. So first one is, are people on infectious disease emergency leave eligible for EI?
Yeah, so it's actually two separate programs. So one is a legislative leave, and one is then if they are on this leave due to COVID, then they can apply for the new benefits put out forward by the government. So it's two separate things. We give them the time off as a job protected leave, and then they have to take their record of employment and apply for those leaves. We don't adjudicate it. The government program adjudicates whether or not they get paid, but certainly I would encourage employees to go and use that time if they can to get paid.
Okay, great. Second one is it required to continue benefits during a temporary layoff, or just recommended because it allows you to extend the temporary layoff from 13 weeks to 35 weeks?
So when they're on a temporary layoff, they're actually still employed by you. So any benefits that they have during employment, you have to consider during this temporary layoff because they're still your employee. So the answer is yes. Certainly it's similar to one notice period and termination, right? It's statutory notice period. You'll still want to continue those benefits as well. So yeah, I would not, there's some questions around if it's a copay, what do you do? If it's a copay, we would still suggest that the employee set up some type of payment scheme while they're off, or somehow try to recoup that when they come back. So yeah, there's some discussions around a copay for benefits, but certainly you want to continue those benefits because they're still your employee.
Great. I'm going to go back to the one that came up during Karina's presentation. I think you touched on a little bit, and then Glenna, your question, if we can, maybe I'll leave it. It's a great question, so I don't want to lose it, but I do want to make sure we circle back to the previous one. So the question was, how can we do better how can we do better to recruit young people that want to stay at our organization, not just use it as a stepping stone for something else? I think between you and Karina, you did kind of talk about making work available remotely, flex work, focusing on culture and impact. I think there was a comment that there's less focus on kind of compensation and promotion and more focus on meaningful work and engagement and work and interpersonal relationships. But do you have any other comments?
Certainly, I think career progression. You know, you've got a lot of people that still want that career progression and what that looks like. And if they feel that they've reached a ceiling and they're not going anywhere, then certainly there's other things that you have to look at. You know, how else can I get them to stay here? So maybe it could be compensation, benefits, other things along those. Good working environment, right? Like a good working environment where they really do value their people means a lot, and people will stay longer because they don't want to take that risk of going to an organization where they really just don't value their employees. So certainly I would say career progression, training and development budget for them, leadership development as well, mentoring and coaching for them is really, really great. So you got to look within the parameters you have. But I mean, I love the idea that Karina has with a gig environment. I think my son is in grade 11. He's already talking about he doesn't want to work for one organization. He wants these gig jobs. And I may have him till he's 30, but you know, that's kind of the way this generation is looking.
Great, thanks, Dana. And as I said, I think we'll leave the question. I'll just mention it quickly and give maybe you some time to think about it over the next little while, and then we'll kind of circle back to it. And if we don't get to it, then we'll make sure that we send out an answer after the seminar. But it is a great question. How do you balance recruiting for culture or fit and adding diversity to your team? I've heard it said that focusing too much on culture is stopping us from having the diversity that we need in our team. So culture is kind of bringing together like-minded people may create a tendency to homogeneity in your workforce. And so how do you kind of combat that and try to focus on diversity as well? So I'll let that sit and you can kind of give that some thought, and we'll circle back to it in a bit.